Well, we are starting a brand new series today called The Rescuer. We're going to go through this first section of the book of Exodus together. We're not going to go through the whole book, but we're going through the action part. We're going through the part, this is the story that everybody knows, or at least thinks they know. We'll be in here for the next 7 weeks looking at the book of Exodus, really seminal book of the Bible. When you really know it well, the Gospels actually come alive to you better. This is the Old Testament's version of the Gospel. What Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is to us, Exodus is for our Jewish friends. So it's an important story. It's a story that Jesus and those who first followed him would have known by heart. Every detail of this story, they would have known it, and it is a story worth knowing. Look with me at Exodus chapter 1. I'm not sure if it's going to be up on. Yeah, it is up on the screen. How fantastic! Verses 8 through 22 is where we're going to be. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. If you have it, say amen. If you don't, say it's up on the screen for you. All right, here we go. This is how it reads, starting in the 8th verse. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel, so they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see one of them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live." But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and let the male children live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live." Today, as we look at this text together, I want us to talk about how God saves. How God saves. Let's pray as we begin together. Father, by your spoken word, the worlds were formed. So now, as your word is preached, would you form our worlds to align with your kingdom, form our character to look like that of your Son. Take my lips and speak through them. Take our minds and think with them. Take our hearts, set them on fire with love for you. It's in Christ's name we ask it. Amen. From the time of the Enlightenment, the argument has gone that as science and technology continue to advance and improve people's lives, that religious faith will become obsolete, will lose its hold on the human imagination, and will move into an era of more rational thinking. I really like science and technology. I'm grateful for it in so many ways. Life expectancy is longer than it used to be. Antibiotics, vaccines, other medical advances have given us more years than people used to have. Computers have been very helpful. They've revolutionized just about every kind of work. I like science. I like technology. And yet, religion has not abated. If anything, it's grown stronger than ever. I think people are more religious than they've ever been. I mean, it might not look like it used to look. It might look different. We might name it different. We might call it things like spirituality or mindfulness or self-actualization. But we still want these things. We still grasp out for something more than just the life that's in front of us. Science and technology hasn't reduced people's desire for something more, for transcendence. At best, science and technology might have distracted some people more effectively, but at worst, it's actually heightened that sense of emptiness, that feeling of being lost, of being trapped, of being stuck, of being bound. Now, we might misname it, we might misdiagnose it, but the reality of it is still there. We're lost, we're bound, we're stuck, and we're in need of saving. I had a friend of mine in seminary, and we were in a discussion in class one day, and he mentioned in the course of our discussion that he didn't really like the word saved. He said that the term has been so abused, it's become so cliche, it's become associated with all the late night televangelists. And, I had to agree, it does have its issues. I have my own difficulties with it. Sometimes when people say saved, what they mean is I prayed a prayer, or what they mean is, they dunked me into water. We seem to associate it with this sort of transactional decision we make concerning our afterlife rather than something God does for us that comprehensively changes everything. And there are many people who have endeavored to find a new vocabulary for faith to reduce the baggage and the misconceptions that swirl around words like sin and salvation. But the new words that we choose, they have difficulties of their own. They have issues of their own. There are some things that are in Christian vocabulary that just don't have a sufficient replacement. There's really nothing else that means the same thing. Sin is not just rule breaking, or it's not just psychosis or sickness. Those things might be helpful analogies, but sin is something more than any of those things. At the root of it, sin is slavery. It's bondage that we can't free ourselves from, that we can't get out of. In Romans chapter 7, Paul writes, even when I know what the right thing to do is, I can't seem to do it. Instead, I'm drawn to the very things that I'm trying not to do. I do the things that I hate. Paul is describing this universal human condition of sin, being trapped, being bound, being stuck, and he asks the question, who can rescue me? Who can deliver me? Who can save me? We need to be rescued. We need to be saved. I told my classmate, I said, yeah, I agree, the word has some issues, but I don't have a better word for what I needed and for what I experienced, or when I look at the world around me and when I talk to people for what they need is being saved. We need to be saved. But how do we communicate what it means to be saved? How do we unload all this unnecessary baggage? How do we get through the connotations and talk about salvation and what that means? Abstract statements, detailed as they may be, they might be good. Doctrinal statements are necessary and helpful, but they're not enough. When the Bible looks to talk about salvation, when it looks to answer the question, what does it mean to be saved, we get a story. In fact, lots of stories, but the very first story in the Bible that answers the question of what it means to be saved is Exodus. Well, what Exodus and the whole Bible communicates is that salvation is not a matter of becoming a better person. It's not a matter of becoming a more moral person. The first thing that you need to see about salvation is that salvation means freedom from bondage. Salvation means being freed from bondage. This opening chapter of Exodus, it picks up where Genesis left off. Some of you remember the story of Joseph. There, he ends up in Egypt through some pretty terrible circumstances. His brothers sold him into slavery. He actually does all right and excels even in slavery because God is with him. But then even that goes wrong and he ends up imprisoned. But then he interprets a dream for Pharaoh and saves Egypt from this severe famine that's coming. And in the end, Joseph recognizes that God had a purpose in it all along. Joseph's father, his brothers, their wives, their kids, they all end up in Egypt with him, and they're respected and treated well because of what Joseph had done for Egypt. But in verse 8 it says there was another king that came, a new dynasty that comes up, this new king that didn't know about Joseph, or maybe he just didn't care about Joseph. All he sees is a growing and flourishing group of people within his borders, and he gets scared. He gets scared. His fear leads him to anxiety. He's worried about this simply because there's just so many of them. They haven't done anything. Nothing's happened. They have shown no disloyalty. There's nothing going on. But he's worried about what might happen, what could happen. And in his anxiety, he acts out of that and says, come, let's deal shrewdly with them. Let's deal shrewdly with them. His answer for his anxiety is to oppress them and make them slaves. In verse 14, you see this repetition. There's one word. It gets translated a few different ways, but it's actually just one Hebrew word that gets repeated 4 times in a single verse. 4 times it gets repeated, but it's just that one word, service. Service, as in being forced to serve. If you were translating literally, it would say, he made their lives bitter with hard serving and all kinds of service in the field. And all their service, they ruthlessly made them serve. Service, that repetition, it's there for emphasis so that you get a picture. Their whole life, their whole existence has been reduced to forced service. They're bound in service to a master. They want to be free, but they're stuck serving. They want to be free, but they're stuck serving. And that's the condition for all of us. We long for freedom, but we always get stuck serving. Now, our tendency in modern culture is to think of freedom as simply freedom from restraint, freedom that's mainly autonomy, the right to simply choose my own direction and my own path. Freedom means that I don't have to serve anything or anyone. But the truth is, we all end up serving something because we all live for something. And whatever it is that you live for, that's what you serve. Bob Dylan, he recognized this truth. He said, you're going to have to serve somebody. Oh, yes, you're going to have to serve somebody. It may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody. We're all serving something, and what Exodus shows us in this opening chapter is that serving anything above God is slavery. Serving anything above God is slavery. Whatever you're living for is what you're serving. It might be your family. It could be your career. It could be your education. It might just be yourself. But what you will discover is that anything that you serve above God will become a tyrant over you. Your life will become bitter with serving that thing. Even good things can end up being sources of anxiety and stress. Even the good things in life can make slaves of us. Your life will be reduced to serving whatever it is that you put above God. Whatever it is that you're thinking, hey, if I just have that, then it'll all be worthwhile. If I have that, then I'll have meaning, I'll have significance, I have hope for the future. If I just have that, whatever that is, marriage or kids or status, whatever it is that you're living for becomes your master. We all have a master. If you want to know who your master is, take a look at what makes you most anxious. Take a look at what makes you most angry. Take a look at what you worry about, what you think about the most, what you strive for. And if it's anything other than God, even if it's yourself, it'll become a tyrant to you. It'll become a pharaoh to you. Freedom is only found in serving God. Because freedom isn't just freedom from. Freedom, in order to be freedom, is always freedom for. Freedom can't function as an end in itself. It requires a greater purpose. We're not just freed from something, we're freed for something. When Moses shows up in front of Pharaoh, in the movie versions, he usually just says, "Let my people go," but that's not actually what he says. The message that he carries from God is, "Let my people go so that they may worship me." so that they may serve me. See, if you're building significance and security on anything other than God's pleasure and delight in you, you'll be enslaved to it. Anything else you look to for security, for significance, for stability will become tyrannical in your life. It will become a slave master. You'll always be striving to get it, and if you get it, you'll be striving to keep it, and if you have it, you'll be anxious about losing it, and you'll be angry when it feels like it's threatened by something. You know, next week marks the 20th anniversary of 9/11. 20 years. Kind of hard to believe that that event is that far back. That event that is so defining for me and so many folks that lived through it is actually history for my son. It'll never feel the same way to him as it did to me, as it did to those of us who lived through it. Just like December 7th, 1941 never felt the same to me or to my parents as it did to my grandparents. But I remember that day. I remember the fear and the shock and the anger that I felt. And I felt those things not just because of the horrible and senseless violence, but I felt those things because I grew up thinking that we were exempt from those sorts of things. I grew up thinking that those sorts of things happened to other people someplace else. And that shock of that it could happen to me and here and to people that I know, it caused me great anxiety. A lot of people, it caused them great anxiety. And I noticed something in the weeks that followed. In the weeks that followed, churches filled up. Churches were packed out because everybody in that state of anxiety was flocking to whatever they felt like might give them back some sense of stability and security. But the rise in church attendance, it was short-lived. It was temporary. Most of those folks, when the pattern kind of fell back into something like normal, they'd stop showing up at church. Why? Because the crisis was over. The crisis was over. See, a crisis is always caused when something that made you feel secure and significant or hopeful is suddenly yanked out from under you, when what you thought was rock solid turns out to be fragile as crystal, and then your life starts shaking and crumbling, and so you start running and reaching for whatever you think will bring your stability back. You've got to serve it with all kinds of service. You'll be working for it. You'll be laboring at it. Forced labor. Your life will become bitter with serving. Anything that you serve above God requires maintenance. It requires work, and it will consume you. It will become Pharaoh to you. Serving anything other than God is slavery. Salvation is rescue from the misery and the anxiety that comes from serving anything other than God, from serving anything above God. Now, there's a second truth that we see in this text, and that is that God will use painful situations. God will use painful situations. When the chapter opens up, it says things have gone well for Abraham's descendants. They're in Egypt. They multiplied. They're prosperous. They're doing good. It's all good. There's this tendency among people, though, that when things are going good, they tend to forget about God. They tend to forget what's important. They tend to start building their life around other things. Yeah, have you ever been to a doctor and they hand you this piece of paper that has a pain point chart? You see it goes like from 1 to 10, and maybe it has a frowny face at one end and a smiley face at the other, and you circle your number. You circle your number that represents how it is that you're feeling, how intense your pain is. But I wonder, what was your number that you had to get to the doctor in the first place? See, because some people go to the doctor when it's like a 1. Other people wait until it's a 9 before they show up at the doctor's office. What does your number have to be at before you do what the doctor says? God has a purpose for Abraham's family. They carry a promise that's going to lead to blessing for the whole world. But if they're just assimilated into Egyptian culture, then that purpose, that promise is lost. And if things keep going well for them, if things just stay as they are, if things keep going good, then it may all be lost. It could be lost. They may not have even remembered that promise after 400 years. So God introduces some discomfort, some pain. We don't really like pain, but pain can actually be a really good thing. Pancreatic cancer is one of the most lethal, devastating forms of cancer there is, because the symptoms don't show up until it's too late. There's no pain, so they don't go to the doctor. They don't get anything checked out because there seems to be nothing wrong. Pain lets you know that something is wrong. Pain lets you know that something is going on that shouldn't be going on. Pain lets you know that something is not as it should be. And at a certain threshold of pain, it'll push us into action. Oh, not just physical pain, but emotional pain can do that to us too. Psychological pain can do that to us too. When it becomes severe enough, it can push us to take some necessary action. The saying, it goes, until the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of change, you'll never change. God introduces some pain into their situation. The irony is that if Pharaoh had just left them alone, they probably would have just become like other Egyptians. They would have lost their identity to their comfort. We can do the same thing sometimes. We get too comfortable and end up losing our identity. But God works behind the scenes. He orchestrates this painful situation. In Daniel chapter 2, it says that God raises up kings and brings them down. He brings about this painful situation. But if you notice, God doesn't actually get mentioned in this text until verse 17. The whole time, all this painful situation is happening, and God doesn't get mentioned at all. When the Pharaoh, to whom Joseph means nothing, comes on the scene, where's God? When they're being made slaves, where is God? In all these years of forced service, where is God? Yeah, life can feel like that sometimes. Things keep getting worse and worse, and no God. Where is God? God is somewhere else. He's not here. He's not in the painful situation. I don't see him in it, so he must not be here. And this story is conveying to us this natural assumption that we have that when things are just getting worse and worse, that God must not be there, or God doesn't care, or maybe God is even punishing us. The past 18 months have been overwhelming, to say the least. Might be a bit of an understatement. It's just been a lot. It's been a lot. I've lost friends. I've had friends that have had to go into the hospital. I've had friends with long-term effects. We had COVID. We had all the arguments about COVID because we all have medical degrees now. You had the conspiracies. You had all the political craziness. And just about the time that I think, okay, finally it's going to maybe get a little bit better, here comes the Delta variant. And then there's still the regularly occurring disasters like hurricanes and blizzards and floods. And the question comes in these situations, where is God? What is God doing in all of this? And some people will embark on theodicy. Theodicy is the attempt to explain what God is doing when we don't really know what God is doing. I don't see him, I don't feel him, but somebody comes with an explanation, it feels right to me, or it seems satisfying to me. I'm attracted to that answer, and we latch on to some theodicy because I'm assuming that because I don't see how any good could come of this, that no good could come of this. So I look for some explanation, even if it's not a very good explanation. I'm wondering, where is God? What is God doing? And I don't have a good answer for it. People have asked me, does this mean it's the end time? I don't know. Does it, is God? I don't know. Let me tell you why Exodus is so relevant, because it subverts that assumption. It subverts the assumption that painful situations are not of God, or that God is not present in my painful situation, or that God may not be working in ways that I don't see. See, we all want to believe that God saves us from painful situations. And thank God, sometimes he does. But the uncomfortable truth that this passage teaches us is that God also saves us through painful situations. Sometimes God will allow discomfort and even pain to come into some area of our life, not to hurt us, but to signal us that something is wrong, something is missing, something is not as it should be. And God can use our pain to get our focus off of ourselves and off of all these lower and lighter and lesser things and onto Him and onto His purposes for us. If God just let us be comfortable all the time, we would just stay right on the road where we're on, and it might be leading to destruction. If we were comfortable all the time, we could end up in places where God doesn't want us to be, away from Him, apart from His purpose, and wasting our lives. So God will sometimes use pain, even pain that He doesn't cause, He can use to direct us back to Him and back to His purposes. Let me just encourage you today, don't let pain push you away from God. Don't let pain make you believe that God doesn't care. Don't let pain convince you that God is not present. Sometimes the pain that we experience is actually an expression of God's love and care for us. Here's the thing. It is a terrible situation. It's a painful situation. But through all of it, in these opening chapters of Exodus, everything that Pharaoh does backfires. All of it. Verse 12 says that they actually multiply more under oppression than they did before. So then he says, well, I'll kill all the male infants, and one of them ends up living in his house, receiving a royal education and all of the training that he needs to lead. Every bad thing that happens ultimately ends up playing into the hands of God. God can use that which He does not cause. He can use it. Every Pharaoh is ultimately an unwitting tool in the hands of God. I'm not saying that all things are good. All things are not good, but all things work together for good for those who love the Lord and are called according to His purpose. I don't have to like what's happening to me. I don't have to like what's going on in the world, but I don't let it lead me to despair. Just because I don't see how God could possibly use something for my good doesn't mean that He can't use it for my good. And there are some things that I probably will never understand this side of eternity. I won't understand. How was that working for me? Where was God in that? What was God doing in that? I may not know the answer to that question this side of eternity, but that's okay. God has not called us to figure out everything that He's doing. He's called us to trust Him even when we don't understand. God is going to use this painful situation to prepare His people so that when He says go, they're going to be ready to leave. They're going to be ready to step into what He has for them. God is using this painful situation to cut some attachments that don't need to be there. And God may be using a painful situation in your life to cut off some attachments so that when He says, let's go, let's step into the next season, let's step into a new level of purpose, that you'll be ready to go. Somebody needs to know today that God can use your painful situation to prepare you. He can use pain to prepare you for your purpose and for your destiny. Your painful situation may be preparation for you to step into what God has for you. Salvation. Salvation means being rescued from bondage to the things that are not, that we serve that are not God. The things that ultimately can't deliver, to things that cannot offer security or stability. And God will use painful situations to cut us off from those things, to draw us to Himself, to detach us from things that are holding us back. But there's a third message that this text conveys to us. Third message, and that is that God saves through unlikely people. God saves through unlikely people. You know, we haven't even gotten to Moses yet. He's not even there yet, but God is there. Saving, rescuing, delivering. It doesn't start with Moses. It starts before Moses gets on the scene. In fact, Moses wouldn't have survived infancy if it weren't for God using some really unlikely people. God always saves not through the strong and the powerful, but through the weak and the powerless. God always saves not through the strong and the powerful, but through the weak and the powerless. Usually when we kind of sense that we're going to need some help, when we feel like we're in need of rescue, we go and we look for someone who's strong. We look for somebody with resources, somebody with power, somebody with influence. In other words, we look for someone or something that appears most likely to be able to come through for us. But God doesn't work like that. He never does. Think back to that first book of the Bible, to Genesis. There are other ancient texts that offer creation stories and flood narratives that sound kind of similar to the stories that the Bible tells. And people will say, well, see, the Bible is not so unique. But what actually makes the Bible unique is not that it tells stories that are totally different from any other stories that were around and about. What makes the Bible unique is the God who shows up there is totally different from any other God. All the other gods in the ancient Near East, Marduk and Ra and all of them, listen, none of them really have any interest in human beings. They mostly deal with each other. They don't seek out relationships with human beings. They're not interested in that. And if they were to, they would be looking for a king. They would be looking for someone with power, someone with wealth, someone we would consider important. But this God, he shows up to an old man and his old barren wife. He shows up to a guy who's not a king or a priest. He's a rancher. Abraham is not a likely character. Certainly there were people who were younger, with all their working parts, with more potential. There were more likely characters, and yet God chooses Abraham. All these people that God uses all through the Old Testament, they're too old, it's too late, they've made too many mistakes, their wives are barren. In the ancient world, the law of primogeniture was nearly universal. It was what held societies together. It was this custom that the firstborn gets the biggest share of the inheritance and leads the family into the next generation. But again and again throughout the Bible, you see God subverting the law of primogeniture. God is always choosing the younger son. God is always choosing the barren women. He's always choosing slaves and outcasts and those who are despised, the unlikely, people who are poor and oppressed and weak and excluded. Because this God works through weakness and even failure. It's Abel, it's not Cain. It's Isaac, it's not Ishmael. It's Jacob, it's not Esau. All the heroes that we find in the first 2 chapters of Exodus are women. Women. And this was a patriarchal culture, but it's women who step to the front. It starts with these midwives. Now, in that culture, midwives were usually women who didn't have children of their own. And in that culture, no children meant that you had no future. There was no 401k, there was no Social Security. Your children were your security, your hope for your old age. So barrenness is the biblical metaphor for hopelessness. These were women whose whole lives were spent serving people who had something that they could never have, something that maybe they used to dream about but gave up on a long time ago. They were the very bottom of the totem pole. But we know their names. We know their names. We actually get their names, Shiphrah and Puah. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the one who seems to have all the power, he doesn't get a name in the story. No name. But the midwives get names, and they're great names. Shiphrah means beautiful. Puah, splendid. And what they do is beautiful and splendid. Everything that Pharaoh did came out of this place of fear, but it was fear of the wrong thing. The midwives also act out of fear, but their fear is of the right thing. Verse 17 says it's because they feared the Lord. That's why they let the boys live. They disobeyed Pharaoh because they feared the Lord. Now were the midwives afraid of Pharaoh? Absolutely, they were afraid of Pharaoh. Yeah, because look, Pharaoh could have them imprisoned, killed, tortured, whatever. His power was basically absolute. Of course, they feared Pharaoh, but they feared God more. And when Pharaoh comes and says, "Why have you done this?" Which I wish I had time. They didn't actually do anything. They let the boys live. They didn't actually do anything. But, when you're afraid of the wrong things, when you're eaten up by anxiety, you'll always feel like people are doing things to you, even if they aren't. Yeah, when Pharaoh confronts them, "Why have you done this?" Do they stand up to the Pharaoh and say, "Well, we did it because you're wrong and we fear God"? No. Instead, actually what they do is they lie. They say, "Hey, look, the Hebrew women, they just spit them out before you can even get there. I mean, it's just, really? I mean, maybe, but probably no." And yet God rewards them. God deals well with them. Does that mean that God approves of lying and deception? No. But here's the thing. They fear God, so God gives them wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So God gives them what to say in the circumstance so that they're preserved from any reprisal, so that they're saved from any violence. See, God will only let Pharaoh's atrocities go so far and no further. Some of you need to know today that whatever you're going through, God's only going to let it go so far and no further. In the end, even Pharaoh ends up being an unlikely person used by God. So God deals with them well. He gives them children of their own. He gives them a hope and a future where there had been no hope and no future before these midwives, Shiphrah, Puah. And the Pharaoh, he's wicked, but he's also inept. He's also inept. I mean, if you really wanted to stop the people from multiplying, this is a bad plan. If you really want to stop the people from multiplying, kill the girls. They're the ones who keep on putting out more people. Pharaoh's plan is foolish, and ultimately it's powerless against what God is doing through seemingly powerless people. But Pharaoh is the most powerful person in that period of history. It's nearly absolute. He's worshipped as a god, and yet all through this text, what you're going to see is nobody's doing what he says. Flash forward to chapter 2. Pharaoh's daughter, she finds one of these babies floating along the river and recognizes it says, as one of the Hebrew babies and decides to keep him anyways. Pharaoh's supposed to be all-powerful, and yet nobody, not the midwives, not even his own daughter, obey him, and everything that he tries to do backfires on him. See, this is all upside down. The one who seems to have all the power actually has none at all. The ones who seem powerless end up prevailing. The one who seems to be on top is actually terrified. The ones who are on the bottom act courageously. And throughout this story, what you're going to see is how God baits Pharaoh with his own fear and lures him to bring about his own destruction through unlikely people, through unlikely circumstances, through things that nobody else would ever think to use. We can sometimes get so focused on Pharaoh, so focused on the things that seem big and powerful, and we'll end up catching his contagious fear. And we'll live in fear of the wrong things, and then we start looking for likely saviors. We start looking for likely solutions. We start looking for something that's reasonable, something that looks like a bigger, better version of Pharaoh, because we're so worried about Pharaoh and how powerful he is. What I need is a more powerful version of him. Fight fire with fire. I'm looking at how big my problem is. I'm looking at how threatening this situation is. I get so focused on Pharaoh. We look for something that seems more powerful than the powerful things that are against us. But that's not how God works. That's not how God does it. It's not how he rescues. It's not how he saves. Paul says, he writes, God chooses the weak things of the world to shame that which is strong. Why? Why does God do it that way? Why does God do it like that? He does it to reveal himself. He does it to reveal himself. He does all of this to show us who the real rescuer is. There's been several movies that are based on Exodus, and I mean, why not? It is a great story. But all of these movies, even they're good. They're entertaining to watch, but they do get something wrong. They all make Moses the main character and God is the sidekick. or at best, God is the offstage director. No. In Exodus, God is the star of the show. He can do it all by himself. I'm saying he can save all by himself. He can deliver by himself. He can do it all on his own. But he says, just so you know who I am, just so you know that I hold all the cards, just so you know that I can work things that aren't good for good. Come here, Shifra. Come here, Pua. He'll pick the ones that nobody else wanted on their team. If you've ever been told that you're a nobody or that you're a loser, if you came in today and you feel insignificant, you feel powerless, oh, guess what? You're perfect. You're just who God is looking for. For 200 plus years, historical critical scholars have tried to figure out who is this Pharaoh? Who is the Pharaoh of the Exodus? There's been various guesses, but in the end, we don't know. Don't know who he is because he doesn't get a name. He doesn't get a name in the story, but God makes sure that everyone, here we are thousands of years later, everyone knows that name, Shifra, Pua. See, the glory of God shines brightest through the most unlikely people, through the unlucky ones, the unloved ones, the ones that nobody else wanted, the ones that nobody else expected, the ones that were underestimated. That's who God wants. See, what you're going to see in Exodus is that God takes Egypt and makes it a stage. This is just the beginning. This is the opening notes of the overture that we've looked at today. The curtain is going to go up, the lights are going to focus center stage, and God is going to reveal himself more clearly than he ever had before. For these enslaved, oppressed people, they're going to see more of God than anybody ever did before. God uses unlikely people. God uses unlikely people. And when God was ready to do his greatest work, he chose the most unlikely person of all. There was another king who decreed that all the male children should be killed, but there was one who escaped the sword, and he grew up to deliver his people. There was another one who ended up rejected in the wilderness. In Luke chapter 9, there's the story of the transfiguration. Jesus is on the Mount of Transfiguration, and it says that Moses and Elijah appeared to him and spoke with him about, the way that it gets translated is, they speak with him about his departure. But the term there, the Greek word is a little tricky to translate. It really is. They were speaking with him about his exodus. They were speaking with him about his exodus, about his work of deliverance. The story that Exodus tells is about God delivering a people who are chosen for his purpose. But the exodus that Jesus achieves on the cross is a way of escape for anybody who wants out. Anybody who wants to escape bondage, anybody who's tired of living to crisis, anybody whose world has crumbled and fallen and been shaken down because you built it around the wrong things, there's freedom for you. You can be free. Jesus is the real rescuer.